Okay, cool. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along today to this webinar. So Sam is going to be presenting today from CertNZ, so I'll let him do a introduction and then he will get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Becky. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Sam Leggett. I'm a senior analyst with Cert New Zealand's Threat and Incident Response team. Thank you so much for jumping in today. Look, Cyber Smart Week is a really important week for us, and support from organisations like Westpac is really key to what we're trying to achieve here. So again, thank you very much for joining in. Hopefully, my goal today is that everyone can take away sort of one thing that they can do in their own lives to improve their own cybersecurity, or at least one thing that they can think about to maybe stay safe from the kinds of scams that are going on out there. The good news is that the things that we can do to keep ourselves safe are often the same things that we can do to help keep the organisations that we work for safe as well. Now, just very quickly, who is CERT? What is a CERT? What does CERT mean? A lot of people may not know that, and that's absolutely fine. CERT is the Computer Emergency Response Team for New Zealand. That's a concept. It's not something specific to NZ, and there's about 650 CERT teams around the world, I believe, both national CERTs and actually CERTs for organisations themselves. We're part of that network, and that's a real benefit as well. We are a government agency, and our goal is ultimately to improve New Zealanders' online security, cybersecurity, and cyber resilience. How do we do that? We provide support, advice, guidance to New Zealanders who may be affected by cybersecurity incidents. Anyone can report through to us using our online reporting form, whether they're an individual, whether they're in a small to medium business, or even a large organisation. We also provide educational resources, things like our life cycle of a ransomware diagram, and presentations just like this one to help people take steps themselves to improve their own cybersecurity. All the information that we have coming into us through our reporting, through our partners like the other CERTs, through organisations that we work quite closely with, where possible, we always publish that data and information into things like our cyber landscape report and our cyber threat report. Those are reports that we do every quarter of the year to give a highlight of the kind of things that we are seeing coming through in our reporting. And of course, we collaborate with a number of different industries, a number of different organisations, government organisations and non-government organisations, to share information to help each other prepare and prevent cybersecurity incidents from occurring in the first place. I didn't tackle questions and answers, but if you do have any questions, please do feel free to ask them. If they are particularly urgent, we will try to get to them at the time, but otherwise we can tackle those at the end too. So today's agenda, just a quick look at what we're seeing. What does the cyber landscape look like at the moment? We have to talk about phishing. Unfortunately, it's the biggest thing that we see reported through to Cert New Zealand. It doesn't sound too serious, but it can result in some pretty major impacts. Talk about some of the business account compromises that we see happening. We'll talk about malware and ransomware. And then we'll finish off on a positive note, thankfully, with some simple steps that everyone can take to improve their own online security. And then lastly, talk a little bit about Cyber Smart Week. Cyber Smart Week this year looks quite different than it has in the past, so we'll have a bit of a discussion around that. Now, wherever I do use technical terms, I do try to catch myself and give a bit of a description of what I'm actually talking about. However, I can get excited when I talk about this stuff because I actually enjoy it. So if I do sort of run off on a train, just pop that in the question section and I will certainly get to it. Alrighty, let's get into it. What are we actually seeing? What's happening in the cyber landscape at the moment? This is a roundup from 2022. So again, we do quarterly reports. However, when we look at sort of a yearly report and the information from that tends to give us a little bit more insights. 8,160 incidents were reported through to us in 2022. And that number does typically tend to rise year on year. Throughout the quarters, it fluctuates just a little bit. But historically, when we look past through the years, it's always been steadily increasing. $20 million in financial loss reported through to us. Now, that one might catch the eye of some people on this call. Why? Because the truth is that number is way too low to be accurate of what's really happening in the New Zealand landscape. I think it was NZBA, don't quote me on that, who estimated in 2022 there was about $180 million of financial loss actually occurring. There's probably even more. I imagine some things even go unreported to the likes of the banks. Potentially 10 times as much financial losses that we're seeing reported through to us. And that is a huge amount of money for everyday New Zealanders to be losing. 41 vulnerabilities were reported through to us. We have what's called a coordinated vulnerability disclosure. What that means is that anyone can let us know about vulnerabilities that might be present in organizational environments. That way, we can let those organizations know, hopefully preventing something bad from happening. And of course, phishing continues to rise, probably will every quarter for the next few years. This time, it made up 56% of the incidents that were reported through to us in 2022. Just a bit of a diagram to show exactly what we're talking about. Phishing, always on the rise. Scams and fraud, always on the rise. Even unauthorized access is always on the rise. Now, scams and fraud, that's something that we've been talking about quite a lot lately due to things like the Exposed exhibition, something that we'll talk about in a little bit. That saw about a 32% increase this quarter from the previous quarter. So that is, again, continuing to rise. Malware might stand out there. Why did it have such a massive spike and then such a massive drop? 2020 saw what we called flu-bot malware hitting New Zealand devices. Because it was hitting so many people's devices, we saw that really big spike. But thankfully, through a joint government international operation, the infrastructure behind that malware was taken down. And so as a result, we see that big drop off in reporting in the malware numbers. Financial loss, of course, is the easiest metric that we can use to sort of measure the harm that's going on. Now, one thing that's really important for me to mention here is that it is not just financial loss that is the type of harm that we see as a result of these cybersecurity incidents. Of course, financial loss itself can cause emotional distress, but actually the incidents themselves, even when there's no financial loss involved, can be really distressing, can be emotionally damaging, especially if there's other things going on in our life at the time. Now, that's really important to call out, but that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. So scams and fraud made up 86% of the overall financial loss in 2022. That is a really big portion, but what's particularly interesting in this area is that 2/3 of that came from people transferring their money themselves. So they've gone through the process of transferring the money. Of course, this is usually under deception, deceit, lies, scams. We know that social engineering is a huge part of that. But that made up 2/3 of the scams and fraud category that we see reported to us. And that's an interesting insight to pull out there. And the vast majority of financial loss of reports that we see does come by way of phishing and credential harvesting. Now, what is phishing? Essentially, it's a malicious practice. Now, you probably all received the phishing message in the last week, if not today. It's the malicious practice of sending messages claiming to be from a reputable person or business when in fact it's not. And they're after personal information, most often financial information through the means of banking login details, your username and password, or even just simply your credit card details. Now, I think this stat was in a slide later, but I do just want to call attention to it. There are organizations out there of really big size in the cybersecurity industry. Microsoft, Trend Micro, Deloitte, just to name a few. And they all estimate that upwards of 84% of incidents of cybersecurity breaches, of the big ones that you hear in the media, actually start with some form of phishing. I was part of a really interesting conversation not too long ago where a professor from Canada was talking about phishing. And he started off by saying that he really enjoyed phishing, and that sounded weird. He meant phishing with an F. But what he was trying to highlight was that when we hear the term phishing with a PH, it doesn't elicit that sense of this is an attack. But that's what it really is. It is someone being deceitful, being malicious in order to get information from you that they should not have. It's an attack on you. That's an attack on your online accounts, on your credentials. And so when we start thinking about it like that, we start to understand this is actually a really major issue. Phishing can often result in some other really serious cybersecurity incidents as well. Speaking of, some of which you've probably heard about. Now, while we don't know this for certain, that the Waikato DHB ransomware occurred by way of phishing, we do know that it's the biggest intrusion vector for things like ransomware. There are cases that have been in the media with a lot of coverage where it has started with phishing. I'm not entirely sure that Latitude is, but I do know that Medibank in Australia was a really great example of that. Financial loss naturally comes by way of phishing when an individual provides their banking login details to a phishing website. The attackers, the scammers, can then capture those, log into the bank account, and maybe get away with some money. So financial loss naturally is an impact here. However, when phishing results in something like ransomware, because through those valid credentials, an attacker was able to gain access to an environment, that's when things can start going wrong for businesses, disruption to business operations. And this is a really great example of Waikato DHB here, where their services were being massively disrupted. Surgeries were being deferred, people were being asked to go to other places because they simply couldn't keep up. Those disruptions were major. And obviously the level of disruption, the level of severity of this disruption is going to change based on the sector that those organizations are in. But nonetheless, that disruption to an organization, especially the smaller organizations, that can be the end of a business in some cases. Often, privacy breaches can occur as well. So again, phishing is the way that the attackers get in the first place. They get those valid credentials, they log into the environments. This can result in information, data that's sensitive, being removed from organizational environments, resulting in those data breaches that we hear about online. Often, this can also result in a ransom attempt as well, where the attackers will claim, I have all this information, I'm going to release it unless you pay me this sum of money. Reputational damage as well. Think about the organizations that have suffered these breaches where customer information was captured by attackers. Naturally, that can cause some reputational damage. What's an interesting point here, though, is that anecdotally, I've seen more reputational damage in cases where organizations have not been upfront about what's gone wrong. Things can happen, organizations can suffer attacks, can suffer breaches, but where they're upfront about it, where they're honest and they say, this is what happened and this is what we're doing about it, typically that sees less reputational damage when they try to keep it hush-hush. Now, that's just anecdotal. That's just a couple of scenarios that I've seen myself. Not going to be true for all cases, but an interesting note nonetheless. And of course, that reputational damage, that disruption to business operations, that can result in a reduction in trust and confidence with your customer base. If you can't keep their information safe, why should they be giving you that information? These are all just some of the impacts that can come by something as simple as the phishing text message that we probably all receive saying that we have an unpaid toll that we need to pay. Let's have a look at some phishing examples. Now, like I say, phishing is essentially just the act of sending messages, pretending to be someone you're not, trying to get something that you shouldn't have. You may have seen this yourself. This is what we call a gift card scam. It's pretty simple. An email gets sent pretending to be someone of authority in an organization asking for an urgent favor. Typically, the CEO in some cases, the executive in some cases, they claim to be in a meeting. They can't take any calls, but they need you to complete this urgent action for them. Once you respond and you say, yep, no worries, I can do that, that's when they start asking for you to do things like buying gift cards. Now, it sounds a little bit weird. What are they trying to do here? Attackers essentially are trying to get you to buy these gift cards, scratch the code, send the code to them. They then take the money on the gift cards. They can either sell it on, they can do some other things to sort of get that in cash value. This is a bit of a weird request. Now, I don't know about anyone on the call. I myself have never had my boss genuinely ask me to go purchase gift cards for him. And maybe not everyone has this relationship with their boss. I tell him to go buy them himself. But there's a couple things that we can look for here. Things that we can spot to tell that this isn't genuine. And the first one is the email address it's actually coming from. Had to redact some information here, but the first email address that we can see, the one it's coming from, ends in AOL.com. Now, if it did come from our organization, if it came from someone in our organization, that should end in the email address in the domain that your email address ends in. For me, cert.govt.nz, if I get an email claiming to be from my boss, but the email address doesn't end in that, I know it's not really from him. That's the first thing to look for. In this case, the request to buy gift cards, that's probably your second red flag. Have you ever been asked that before? Have you heard of anyone else in the organization being asked that before? These are a couple of things that we can look for in this case. And gift card scams are a small portion of phishing, but it happens more than you'd think, and people do fall for it more than you think. This is what phishing really looks like, though. These are the ones that you guys have probably gotten yourself. I've certainly received them myself. The NZTA, got to renew your rego, the IRD, there's a refund waiting for you. These are pretty classic phishing scams. Now, I've already called out one thing that we can look for. Where has the email come from? The first example is actually not too bad at making it look pretty genuine, nzta.co.nz. However, nzta.govt.nz is the genuine domain here. Now, the next one, the IRD one, that's a little bit more egregious. I don't even know what that domain ends in, bigglobe.ne.jp. Sounds weird. It's certainly nothing to do with IRD. So this is the first thing that we can look for. We're going to look at examples of text messages as well, but where the actual message is coming from, that's the first thing to check. If it doesn't line up, that's our first red flag. What's the next thing that we can look for? What are they trying to get us to do? Typically, it's click on a link. Typically, they want us to click on a link because that's going to take us to a phishing page that'll capture our credentials after we enter them. That's the second thing that we can look for. Now, in emails, every now and again, like the NZTA example, links will actually appear as buttons. The good news is that you can hover over that button without clicking. The link itself will actually appear on screen like it does in this example. Sometimes that's in the bottom left or right-hand corner of your screen. This will show us the link that they're trying to get us to click on, and the same rules apply. If NZTA email us and send us a link and it's genuine, that link should end in nzta.govt.nz. Now, this can get a little tricky when shortened URLs are at play. This is things like bit.ly or bit.ly. You've probably seen these links yourself. Essentially, these just obfuscate what the link actually is. There's some online services, some web pages where you can plug a link in there and it'll tell you what the real link really is. But the fact that a bit.ly or a shortened link has been used can sometimes be considered a red flag, especially from a really big organization. Not in all cases, sometimes they are genuinely used. In those cases, it's really good to take the link, plug it into those websites and see what the real link actually is. But this is the second thing that we can look for. Where is it trying to take us? Is it the right website address? If it's not, that's our second red flag. The next one is it actually relevant to you? Do you have a car? Do you have a rego that needs to be renewed? Did you renew it last week? If the content of the message is not relevant to you, this is also a good indication that we might not be dealing with something genuine. Now, these things kind of stack up, and if you start to notice a couple things and it doesn't seem quite right, trust your gut, it's probably phishing. And the best thing that you can do is not click on those links and report it to the relevant teams. Now, emails can be reported to CertNZ. We can take the link out, we can plug it into what we call our phishing disruption service. We can attempt to take those sites down through the hosting providers. There's a bunch of things that we can do there. However, if you get sent this to your organizational email address, the best thing to do is report it to the relevant team within your organization. It's going to give them the tools they need to make sure that no one else in the organization can click on that link, fall victim to that particular campaign. Historically, phishing has been largely email-based. However, lately we've seen a particular spike in SMS phishing, text message phishing essentially. The same rules do apply though. The first thing that we're going to look at is where has the text message come from. Now, this is not a catch-all, but most cases, any big reputable organization sending text messages probably have to send so many to so many customers that they're going to employ a text service. That means that their text messages are likely going to come from a short code number, either 3 digits or 4 digits. Where we see a text message claiming to come from BNZ, from NZ Post or NZTA, from an individual mobile number, that's red flag number 1. Interestingly, in the first 2 examples, we see Australian mobile numbers, but we've also got a New Zealand mobile number in there. Certainly, if you get a text message from a New Zealand organization from an Australian mobile number, that should certainly put up a red flag for you. Again, the next thing we can look at is where is it trying to take us? What link is it trying to get us to click on? A little bit easier with text messages because the links are typically fully present in the message itself, like you can see on screen. But we're going to look at the link again and whether or not it makes sense. NZ Post, that domain should be nzpost.co.nz. This one is nzpost.life. That's our red flag there. BNZ, bnz.co.nz. In this case, bnzauthDetails.com. And as an example of a shortened link, we have t.ly/pay.nzta.govt. Now the .govt, that sometimes catches people out. It looks pretty good at first glance, but when you take a little bit of a closer look, you can pretty easily tell that that's not a genuine link there. Again, look at the content of the message. If it's NZTA claiming that you went on a toll road, have you travelled a toll road recently? If it's NZ Post claiming you've got a package to be delivered, have you ordered anything? Do you actually bank with BNZ? That seems a little bit silly, but I've seen many cases where people are reporting things because they get a text message claiming they've had unauthorized access to their BNZ account, but they bank with Westpac. Doesn't make any sense for them. They know it's a scam. They've spotted that red flag, and that's really positive. However, even if you're one of the people that do spot these things, kudos to you. I encourage you to spot these red flags yourself. Everyone can do it. Reporting it is really powerful. Through reporting it, you might save the next person from clicking on that link and falling victim. Text messages in particular, they can be forwarded to DIA free of charge on 7726. It does need to be forwarded though. DIA can pull out some really key information, and then they're really good at information sharing with relevant organizations like ourselves wherever we need to do something too. Again, though, if this comes to your work mobile, reporting it to the relevant team within your organization is really important. And look, I know it can be a pain to report to multiple places. In that case, I'd love to see reports of everything, but the truth is if you get this to your organizational environment on your work phone, to your work email address, reporting it to your organizational security team is the most important thing to do. Just a little bit of a recap. What can we check for? Where are these messages coming from? What's the email address it's coming from? What's the phone number it's coming from? Again, individual mobile numbers should spin up a bit of a red flag. Typically, big organizations send from short codes, and email addresses, they should end in the correct domain for the website or the business that we're dealing with. We can check the URLs and the links that they're trying to get us to click on. Now, it is worth calling out here that not all phishing messages contain links. Every now and again, they also contain phone numbers. That's where phone scams can start happening. You can simply take the phone number they're trying to get you to call, Google search it, see if it's actually linked or relevant to the organization it's claiming to be. And if you can't find any connection, that's a good indication that it's not a phone number relevant to them. You're probably dealing with a scam. A couple other things that we can look for. And it's really important to take this message on board that we need to stop and think about it before we click anything, before we provide any details. We know one of the main ways that people are falling victim to these things is because these messages come through at a time where we're already vulnerable. There's something else is going on in our life. And we have that moment of vulnerability where we click the link without thinking and provide that information. So taking a moment to think about these things, these messages also often create a sense of urgency, a sense of panic, claiming that money's been transferred out of your account, claiming that you need to pay a fee immediately because it's 21 days overdue, trying to create that sense of fear, that sense of panic, that sense of urgency, so that you click that link and provide those details out of that urgency. Just stopping for a moment, reading the message, looking at things like where it's come from, where it's trying to take us, what it's asking for, whether or not this makes sense for us, are all good things to stop and do. Maybe have a chat to someone else around you. Hey, does this look genuine? I'm not too sure about it. If they have concerns, that's a really good indication. Again, you might be dealing with a scam. And of course, reporting it is really important as well. Again, emails, they can be sent directly to fishpond@ops.cert.govt. It's a weird sounding email address, but that's our phishing disruption service email address. That'll go straight into the system, and an analyst at CertNZ will investigate that email, that website, and take the appropriate action. Text messages, DIA 7726, forward those on there free of charge. And again, if it's coming through to your organizational side of things, report it to the relevant team at Westpac. Alrighty. This is a whole lot of bad news. It's okay. We're going to get to some good points later on, some things that we can do to keep ourselves safe, as well as what we can do to spot these things that we've already talked about. Scams target businesses as well. It's not just individuals. Invoice scams are particularly nasty when it comes to businesses. What does that mean? There's a couple different ways that we see invoice scams happening. One, just completely fake invoices coming from completely fake email addresses. The email addresses will try to mimic genuine organizational email addresses, but again, we know what to look for now. We're looking for that domain at the end to be relevant and correct and accurate to the organization we're dealing with. Typically, businesses have good processes in place to check invoices without simply paying them, and so making sure that any invoices go through the appropriate processes is really important. However, the particularly nasty version of invoice scams are where email accounts within our business have actually been compromised. Genuine invoices have been captured and they've been altered. Typically, the details that we see altered on an invoice are simply the account number that needs to be paid to and any contact details that are actually on that invoice as well. And that's a really important note. If you're in a position where you're dealing with invoices and you see some changes on an invoice, like the bank account number that needs to be paid to, you might think to yourself, well, I'll call the number on the invoice and I'll just double check this. If it is an invoice scam, and typically those contact details will have been changed too, you'll end up actually talking to the scammer. Verifying any changes to any invoices using processes that you already have in place are really important. So you probably have phone numbers that you've used to call those organizations in the past. Simply ringing them on that number that you've used before, not the number or email address that's on the invoice itself, to confirm whether or not that change is genuine. That's a really important step to take. Check the email address it's coming from. If you do have an invoice that's got some odd looking changes on it, that verification part is really important, but check the email it's come from. And if it has come from an organizational email, then letting that person or the relevant team know that that email address may be compromised is a really important step to take as well. Some other things that we can do, electronic invoicing options are a really great thing to implement here to sort of avoid these scams from taking place. Remote access scams are particularly nasty. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, especially where those phishing emails have numbers for people to call in them rather than links for people to click. Typically what will happen is that you'll get on the phone. Now these do happen out of the blue as well. It's not just people calling themselves. Typically they can often get calls out of the blue where these kinds of scams will take place. Someone will get on the phone with you. They'll claim to be from a technical organization, a Microsoft, a Spark, something like that. They often claim that there's some kind of issue with your internet or your computer, and that in order to fix the issue, they need to log into your system so that they can investigate and remediate. We've also seen bank impersonation in terms of remote access scams as well. Unfortunately, what happens is if I allow someone remote access to my laptop, it's essentially like me being on the laptop. Now, if I'm auto-logged into any accounts, like my bank account, like my email account, essentially the attacker also has access to those accounts as well. Maybe I save my passwords to my browser. Now they can simply plug that password into that website when they try to log in there. The tricky thing around remote access scams is that it just looks like the same person is logged in from the same device, on the same cookie, on the same IP address. Everything looks exactly the same. And it's often through this that a lot of the checks that are in place to stop these things from happening don't spin up, because it looks like the same person on the same device from all the same key pieces of information. Great advice here is simply don't download any remote access software if someone on the phone asks you to, especially if it's out of the blue. Now, remote access software does have genuine purposes. Just like any other tool out there, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. If you need remote access software, if you need someone to get remote access to your device, you will know about it. Typically, this will be because you've made a request to an IT department, to a private IT organization to help you in some capacity, to give you a service. You'll know that they need remote access. There'll probably be agreements in place. There'll be things that you need to sign. If you get a call out of the blue, they ask you to download remote access software, I give you permission to hang up on them immediately. It's a really important thing to note, because if they do get that level of access to our device, it can be pretty damaging to all our online accounts. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. As I kind of said, don't give remote access to someone unless you've requested it first. Never access banking or sensitive information while you're in a remote access session. And turn off any saved passwords or auto login features while you're in a remote access session as well. Typically, this can be easily done by simply logging out of the account where you might save your passwords or have those auto login features. That might be your Gmail account, for example. If you do get these calls, it's really important to report them as well. If you report them to us, we can work with organizations like the Telecommunications Forum to look at those phone numbers, where they're hosted, and prevent them from calling other people. Malware and ransomware. Now, we talked about Flubot a little bit. That's a really great example of malware. Typically, malware is designed to get some kind of information out of a device. Malicious software is where malware comes from. There's a few different types of malware. The most common ones that we see are info stealing malware or key logging malware. And what they do is essentially grab your credentials when you enter them after you've been infected. So maybe I get an email, maybe it has a dodgy attachment. Unfortunately, I clicked on it. I've got a lot going on in the background. I didn't think about it. I clicked on that attachment. My laptop now has malware. The next time I go and log into my bank account, there are specific types of malware that could capture those login credentials and send them back to the attacker. There's a lot of different types of malware, things like spyware, so you can monitor activity on the device, or even adware, so it's got ads playing in the background, and that's how some scammers or attackers can get revenue that way. They're typically delivered through malicious attachments in emails, through drive-by downloads on malicious websites, even portable devices, and that's why it's really important never to plug a USB that you find or that you get gifted into one of your devices without cleaning it first. We've actually seen cases where in certain areas of New Zealand, there have been USB drops all around the place, and they've actually contained malicious software on them. Flubot, as an example of malware, Flubot luckily didn't have too many major impacts to New Zealand bar disruption. The variant that we saw was particularly targeting Australia, and so the web overlays that were in place there to capture certain credentials couldn't quite work on NZ networks and devices, so that's the good news. What it did manage to do, though, is capture the list of contacts from all the devices it was able to infect. So it's a great example of malware getting into a system, capturing certain information, and sending it back to that attacker. Ransomware is probably the worst kind of malware, and it's probably the worst kind of incident for an organization. What is ransomware? It's essentially malware that is designed to lock down information, lock down systems, lock down data, lock down files. Typically, ransomware attacks will start with the lockdown of all that information, and that's when the ransom attempt begins. You'll get a note from the attacker saying, I've locked everything down. The only way you can get access back is if you pay me this amount of money by this date. Ransomware can be really damaging for organizations. Ransomware can result in organizations going under, and it's really quite sad. Unfortunately, where some organizations may think to themselves, well, if I just pay this ransom, I'll get everything back and everything will be okay. Simply isn't the reality. We've seen too many cases where...
Recruiter.
Oh, was that a question? Someone maybe someone just accidentally came off mute. Well, we'll continue, and if there is a question, just pop it in the Q&A. Yeah, so ransomware, unfortunately, there's no guarantee upon paying that ransom that you get your information back, that you get your data or your files back. And actually, what we've been seeing lately is that paying the ransom signals to the attacker that you're willing to pay. That's when they come in and they say, actually, your system's worth more money. You need to pay us again. Actually, we took all the data from your system. We'll give you access back, but unless you pay us a second ransom, we're still going to leak all that information online. This is why the New Zealand government has a really strong position around not paying ransoms to ransomware actors. The unfortunate reality is it's just simply no guarantee that you'll get it back. You're actually probably also funding further criminal activity by paying those ransoms. I'm going to quickly mention backups here. I don't believe it's mentioned in any other slides. But backups are really important when it comes to ransomware, especially for an organization. Now, what's on screen at the moment is something I mentioned earlier, life cycle of a ransomware incident. Basically tries to describe what a ransomware attack looks like, how it starts, how it moves within the environment, the impacts that it has at the end. What's also mapped on here is what we call critical controls. These are security controls that we think are most important, critical. And one of these is backups. Now, backups are kind of the golden ticket when it comes to recovering from a ransomware incident. Having regular backups, having backups that are secured and stored in a different location to our operational network means that if something like this does happen to us, we can start that recovery process. We can start restoring our information, our data, our systems from that backup that we have without having to play the game of the ransomware attackers. This diagram is something that's had a lot of really positive feedback on it lately and in the past, especially in the sense that what it allows people to do who are often in IT security teams is take this to the ones that make the decisions in terms of investment and say, look, if we can implement these controls in these places, this is how it's going to help protect us from an incident like ransomware. And that's a really powerful thing. Okay, that was a lot of bad news. That was a lot of, what can go wrong, what's going to happen to us if we don't get it right. The good news is that there's a couple simple steps, a few simple steps that we can all take to make things a little bit easier. Now, my goal is to make these achievable. Some of them are going to sound a little bit tough, but bear with me. Long, strong, and unique passwords. And once upon a time, I would do these presentations and I would say that people should have long, strong, and unique passwords on all their accounts. And that was incredibly hypocritical of me because I do not do that myself. The truth is, there are a few particular accounts that really need your attention, that really need to be secured with long, strong, and unique passwords. These are things like our bank accounts, our email accounts, because they're often linked to all our other accounts. Someone can get in there, they can often get into every other account that's linked to it. Social media accounts, people often don't realize, but if those are breached, it's our friends and whānau that typically get targeted as a result, and they're more likely to believe messages seems to genuinely be coming from someone that they love. I've completely lost my train of thought. Longer is stronger. However, it's hard to remember long passwords. We recommend at least 15 characters, and an easy way that you can create a decent password for yourself is by using a passphrase. Now, a passphrase password is not going to be as strong as a completely random password, 30 characters long, random letters, numbers, symbols, and all that good stuff. However, it's going to be a lot easier, a lot more achievable to remember a passphrase password ourselves. Now, a great example of this is, I really like the saying, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. You'd have to know me pretty well to know that I like that saying, but I can take that saying and I can mess around with it a little bit. I can meet certain complexity requirements, and I've got myself a pretty decent password. The other important key here is that our passwords can't be based on personal information. People often don't realize, but if we use, say, our pet's name, our kid's name, our surname, maiden name, all these kinds of personal information, that information can often be found online. That information can often be used against us to try and breach our passwords. Avoiding using any personal information like that can be found online is really important to make sure our passwords are strong and secure. We also need to avoid patterns. Look, it's human nature to create easy passwords where we can, especially when we're told we have to change it every 3 months. Most people will put a 1 on the end, and 3 months come around, they change that 1 to a 2. Another 3 months, that 2 becomes a 3. Another 3 months, that 3 becomes a 4. You see where I'm going with this. It's human nature to follow these patterns, to add an exclamation mark at the end of the password where a symbol is required, to substitute an A for an at, where again a symbol is required. But avoiding these really common patterns is important because attackers know that we follow these patterns. The last thing that I recommend around passwords is password managers. Now, what password managers allow us to do is put all our effort and energy into one password alone. Password managers will store all our other passwords. They'll even generate these passwords for us. They'll generate passwords that are 30 characters long, completely random, really strong and secure. But we do need to put the time and energy into that one master password. That master password becomes the keys to the kingdom. And so it's really important that we make sure that one password is really long, strong, and secure. If you are going to consider password manager, I would also encourage you to look for ones that allow you to implement our next tip, which is two-factor authentication. We'll talk about that just in a sec. The last thing here is Have I Been Pwned? That sounds like a really weird website. Why would a security professional be recommending a website that sounds like that? Because what this website allows you to do is figure out anywhere that your information has been caught up in a data breach. You can pop your email address in there, and anywhere that you have an account linked to that email address and that's been caught up in a data breach, the site will tell you. It'll also tell you information like what was caught in that data breach, your email address, your password, your name, etc. It'll tell you what's been caught up in there. And this really highlights the risk around password reuse. So it's pretty common for people to use the same password across all their accounts. And look, I get it. Again, it's human nature. But where a data breach occurs and it has our password in it, that's all our online accounts at risk now. And that's why we recommend you start with those really important critical accounts. And again, that's your bank account, your email account, your social media, and then the additional things like any government accounts you might have, IRD, for example, or a RealMe, any kind of online identity accounts as well. Start with those, get a few good passwords there. Even if that's all you do, even if 2 or 3 accounts are all you do, that's still going to put you in a much better position than using the same password everywhere or using weaker passwords that are built on personal information. Mentioned it quickly, and I mention it everywhere I go because it's so powerful. Two-factor authentication, also known as multi-factor authentication or two-step verification. It's an additional layer of security on top of our password and username combination. It means that even if we fall victim to that phishing, even if we do click the link in that text message and we provide our login credentials, we've got another layer of protection to keep ourselves safe. And it can actually act as an alert that someone else is trying to access our account. If we get a two-factor authentication challenge and we have not tried to log in, that tells us that someone else is trying to log in. We might need to go pay some attention to that account and change that password, log out any auto logins, these kinds of actions. 2FA is typically a unique code that's sent to your phone, often by a text message. It may be a code generated by an authenticator app that you have on your phone. It might be a push notification through an app. It may even be a biometrics challenge through an app. And recently, we've also seen changes where the website that you're trying to log into creates the code. That code needs to be entered into the authenticator app on your phone, and that's how you get through the two-factor authentication challenge. Whatever form you choose to use, this is so powerful because we know that the main way attackers are getting into things like our accounts is through phishing, is through the use of our valid credentials captured through deception. So if we put two-factor authentication on our accounts, that gives us that additional protection, even if our credentials get compromised. Again, I recommend starting with those really important accounts, right? Your bank account, your email account, social media, any government accounts, anything that's really important to you or has any sensitive information about you. Start with those accounts, enable it there, and you'll put yourself in a really good position moving forward. Now, how do you enable two-factor authentication? Changes based on platform to platform, but typically the method is the same. You look at the settings for the account, you look at the account management section, look for privacy, look for security, these kinds of keywords. Under those settings, under those headings, you'll probably find some section called two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, two-step verification. It does have different terminologies, but it is all the same kind of thing. The other good news is that two-factor authentication is often free. You get all that additional protection for no extra charge. Why would you not want to do that? All right, updating our devices. Look, the truth is we've all had the pop-up in the bottom right-hand screen, corner of our screen saying, would you like to update your device now, or would you like to push it off for 7 days? And we've all pushed it off for 7 days. I've done that myself too. It's important to get these updates as soon as possible, especially on our business devices. Now, we probably have some policies in place that means the updates will happen at a certain time, whether we want them to or not. But often employees get given a little bit of leeway. You can push this update out for a day or two. You might have some really critical work going on at the time and you don't want your laptop to shut down. Totally understandable. But installing that update as soon as possible is really important. Whilst phishing is the main way that attackers are getting into systems, vulnerability exploitation is probably the second biggest. What is that? Software often have security vulnerabilities popping up in them just by nature of the beast. Vendors will release updates or patches to address these vulnerabilities, not just give us the latest features, certainly that's part of it, but it is also addressing these security vulnerabilities, putting patches over them so that they can't be exploited to gain access to our systems. Where possible, turn updates to happen automatically, and that way you don't have to think about it. But updates as soon as possible from the vendors are really important to keep our devices nice and safe. Privacy online, I've talked a little bit about personal information as we've gone through this, how personal information can be used against us. There's a couple of stories that are in our exposed exhibition, which go into detail about how personal information found on social media has been used to create incredibly compelling targeted narratives to create victims. Personal information is often part of our passwords as well, and if it's online, it can be used against us to try and crack those passwords. Turning our privacy settings to private or friends only wherever possible is a great step to take to know exactly who can see the information that we have online. Some people won't be able to do that. Some people require their social media to have a public facing aspect to it. It might be for business reasons, it may be for other reasons. In those cases, understanding what information you're putting out online and who can see it and how it can be used against you is really important to know. If it is for business reasons, then separating those accounts out from business and personal is a great step to take, just to control the level of personal information that we're putting out there. In the past, Cyber Smart Week has always had the 4 tips that we've just talked about, and this is a new one that we've started to talk about this year. Think before you click. I've touched on this already, but we know that one of the main ways that people are clicking on links and providing information is because they're acting out of a sense of fear or panic. Often these messages will try to elicit that sense of fear or panic in us so that we will click on that link without thinking and provide those credentials without thinking. But this also applies to the idea that these messages can come through at any time. You know, we can get a text message when we're having the worst day of our lives, and that might be a malicious text message. That might be the one that we click on, we provide details to, because how can we deal with an unauthorized transfer from a bank account when we're already dealing with the worst day of our lives? This is a common theme that we see in stories, and so it's really important not to act out of that fear, not to act out of that urgency. Take a moment, look through some of the stuff that we've talked about, where it's coming from, what it's asking you to do, what link it's asking you to click on. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. If you have any concerns around it, trust your gut, report it to the appropriate people, have a chat to the people around you and see what they think. Think before you click, and if you can, avoid clicking links and messages altogether. That's not the easiest thing to do, I know. But if you can navigate to the website yourself rather than clicking on a link, that's a great way to make sure you aren't providing your credentials to any kind of phishing websites. As we've gone through, I've talked about Cyber Smart Week. It's obviously a really important week for us where we try to get some real change in terms of cybersecurity practices, or at least the thinking around cybersecurity. In the past, we've pushed 4 tips really quite hard, and they've been championed by 4 robots. People often really like those robots, but we did need to make a change this year based on some of the research that we've done. We know that around 80% of New Zealanders, both individual and SME, are saying that they regularly hear about cybersecurity incidents, and I think this is weekly. It's a pretty big number that are hearing about these kinds of things happening regularly. However, only 17% of people actually adopt some new cybersecurity behaviors to stay safe. There's a real discrepancy there, and we think the reason being is because while Cert New Zealand has a great brand that lands with big organizations and IT professionals, it's falling short with individuals and SMEs. Cybersecurity is seen as too difficult, too challenging, too technical, too scary for these individuals and SME audiences. And so we've changed what we're doing with Cyber Smart Week in 2023. What we've done this year is an exhibition called Exposed. Exposed brings the story of 10 real New Zealanders who went through real cybersecurity incidents or scams, and they talk about their stories to bring light to what the impacts were to them. Not just the financial impacts, the mental and the emotional impacts as well. And I think this is really powerful. I can sit in front of people and I can tell you what can go wrong if you don't get it right, but the emotional element is lacking in those cases. When we hear from someone who's lived it, who went through that negative experience, it starts to actually have an impact on us. And what it also highlights is that whilst it may take you an hour or 2 to figure out a decent password and put that on your critical accounts, it may take you an hour to figure out how to implement 2-factor authentication. That hour, those 2 hours, those 3 hours, it's a lot less than the days, weeks, months that you might spend trying to recover from a cybersecurity incident if it does happen. A lot of other activity around this Cyber Smart Week. Like I say, the exhibition, Exposed, that's actually in Auckland today. If you are up there, I encourage you to get along. I think that's still on for today and tomorrow. However, not everyone can get to Auckland. We totally understand that. So we will be putting them on ownyouronline.govt.nz. I'm going to talk about that site in just a second, but we're going to keep these real stories there so that we can hopefully combat the stigma around being embarrassed or ashamed, too embarrassed or too ashamed to actually report what happened, but also to highlight what the impacts of these things can really be. Outdoor billboards, social media advertising, online advertising, webinars like the one that you're here on today, these are all part of Cyber Smart Week for us. Mentioned Own Your Online, what is this? This is our solution for the fact that Cert New Zealand was not hitting the mark with the small to medium businesses and the individuals. Own Your Online is not a rebranding of Cert, but it is a new website that we've spun up specifically targeting individuals and SMEs. The goal of Own Your Online is to make that information around cybersecurity more approachable, more accessible, and easier for people to actually understand. That way, if they can read this information and they can actually understand it, they can take it away and they can implement it in their own lives. Thank you so much for listening to me today. That's everything that I have to talk about so far, but we do have about 10 minutes left for any questions that anyone might have. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them and I'll do my very best to answer them. Might actually have some in the chat already. Let me have a quick look. Oh, I think there's just been some additions to some of the stuff I've said, which is great. Do we know the split of individuals versus businesses? Yeah, absolutely. It's not something that I had with me today, but I do encourage you to jump on cert.govt.nz, specifically the quarterly reports. The one in particular is the Data Landscapes report, and that breaks down the incidents between individuals and businesses into different areas. So we can see specifically what businesses are reporting through to us and specifically what individuals are reporting through to us. That said, what I do know off the top of my head is that the most reported incident for organizations as well is phishing and credential harvesting, as these text messages, these emails coming through to their organizational email addresses or their work phones, these kinds of things. That is the main reported incident there as well. Business email compromise is a particularly nasty one for organizations. And typically we see ransomware, whilst the numbers are low, those reports tend to come from solely businesses. But that information is available. Do encourage you to jump on CERT's website and have a look at that. What are the differences between scams and phishing? Yep, they are considered different categories. Phishing is a bit of a broad term. Like I say, it does kind of cover any message that has intent to deceive and get certain information from people. Scams are more particular scams that we see. So invoice scams are a great example. Text scams are a great example. The phone calls, phishing scams is sometimes they're called, voice phishing. So phishing, the reports are typically people letting us know, I got this email, I got this text message, I believe it to be phishing. Scams often can be the things that result if we fall victim to phishing. And sometimes people don't even realize that the incident they're dealing with may have started with phishing in the first place. There is a lot of interconnectivity between these types of incidents and these categories. And that's something we'd love to capture in our data. It does require a little bit more information and reporting in some cases, but certainly there is a bit of overlap between these categories, because phishing can be the first thing that happens, and the business email compromise and the scams that result off the back of that can be the impact or the result. Social media is another great example. If our social media accounts are breached, someone gains unauthorized access to those accounts, then our friends, our family, our loved ones may be the targets of scams by way of that unauthorized access. URLs and text messages. Understand all NZ banks have agreed to cease sending text messages with URLs by 31 December this year. Yeah, absolutely. This was in the media recently, where the banks in New Zealand have started to agree that they will no longer be sending text messages that contain links. And that is so powerful. And the reason I'm thinking it's so powerful is specifically for the individual customer bases of each of those banks. Those banks can now talk to their customers and they can say, look, we're not going to send you a text with a link in it. If you receive a text with a link in it that claims to be from us, it is not from us, you're dealing with a scam. That is really powerful. That very clear, concise, straightforward messaging to the entire consumer base, customer base is incredibly powerful. And it's really great to see these kinds of things starting to happen, these kinds of changes starting to occur. Caitlin jumped in there and added some information about how you can report to Westpac specifically. Absolutely. And like I say, look, I'd love to see reports of everything that's going on in New Zealand, but that's not realistic. Reporting to multiple places can be pretty arduous. If you get something to your work email or your work phone, I encourage you to report to Westpac first and foremost. If you have it within you to report to CERT New Zealand as well, great, that's awesome. I would encourage you to do so. If you're only going to do it to one place, and I totally understand that, Westpac for the organizational side of things is most important. Do you recommend password managers for personal use? I love this question. I always get this question, and I often wonder if it's off the back of the LastPass breach that occurred, I think last year. It may have been a year before. Password managers are, in my mind, still a great option, but there's a couple things that you need to consider around your password manager if you are going to use one. Touched on it quickly. That master password for your password manager has got to be long, strong, unique, and secure. Can't be built on personal information. It can't follow those common trends. It can't be a password that's been breached in the past. It can't be something that can be cracked based on personal information that can be found online, and it needs to be long enough. You do need to put that effort, that time, that energy into making that password fit for purpose. It is, as its name states, it's your master password. It's your password for everything. The other recommendation I would make if you're looking at a password manager is to consider whether or not they offer some form of two-factor authentication. If we have all our passwords behind one password stored in one sort of online vault, if you will, we need as much security around that as we can. We can get a password manager that has 2FA as an option. More power to us. We can keep that password manager just a little bit safer. The other consideration that always comes up with password managers is also whether or not we use a third-party password manager, or what about the built-in browser password managers. Certainly not something that I would recommend in organizational space, but I do understand why some people in a personal capacity would choose to use an in-browser password manager. Some things you need to consider. Your Google account, for example, if you're using the Chrome password manager, now just became your password manager account. The password for your Google account, your Gmail account, has got to be treated like a master password. It's got to be fit for purpose. Turn on that 2FA, turn on that two-step verification, get that additional layer of protection. Your password manager is now built into Google Chrome, so you need to make sure that Google Chrome is updated as soon as possible, as soon as the updates come out regularly. Make sure it's got the latest update as soon as possible, so you're not at risk of vulnerability exploitation getting into your password managers. The device that you maybe stay auto-logged into your Google Chrome account needs to be secured with a good password or a code, biometrics even. I'd actually go so far as to suggest that you don't stay auto-logged into that Gmail account on any devices if you're using the Chrome password manager. Pros and cons to these things, but if we do choose to go down that route, it's important that we understand the risks and the threats associated with it. Looks like there's a recommended password manager, which is great. I'm not allowed to make certain recommendations myself by way of being part of a government organization, but certainly there's some important things to consider around them. Some good questions to ask, and if you've got organizations making strong recommendations, then there's always good things to follow. How cyber teams and organizations do without end users being educated, being onboarded through sessions like this, there's always a chance of breach happening. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely spot on. I mentioned quickly our 10 critical controls earlier. We changed that year on year based on the things that we see coming into Cert New Zealand. And the newest one in 2023 was called Building Cybersecurity Awareness. It's about bringing people in your organization, or even your friends and your family, along on the cybersecurity journey with you. It's about saying, hey, look, if you have an email account, if you have a phone number, you're probably going to get these phishing messages. It's no longer a case of we're little old New Zealand in the corner of the world, pretty removed from everyone. If you're online, you're likely going to be a target. The thing is with phishing, it's volumetric. It's a numbers game for these attackers. They send out as many emails as they possibly can, trying to make as many victims as they can. And in that sense, we are all potential targets of this kind of thing, and we need to know that we're going to receive these things. A little bit of awareness that it's going to happen, that we're likely going to receive it, a few things to look out for, and knowing where to report it are all really important things in that space. Still got a couple minutes, might be able to get through a couple more. Any recommendations on password managers? Yeah, again, look, I'm really sorry. Being part of a government organization means that I can't make specific recommendations on certain products, even though I would sometimes really like to. I think there's just a few important things around password managers. Look for that 2FA option. If a password manager has it, then there's a little bit more security in that sense. But also maybe do a little bit of research on the password manager. Have they had a breach in the past? And maybe more importantly, how did they handle that breach? Were they upfront about it? Did they tell their customer base? Did they take action to make sure it won't happen again? Did they improve their cybersecurity position? Maybe you want to be a little bit more reassured and go with a password manager that have never suffered a data breach or anything like that in the past. Just some good questions to ask around a password manager before you consider looking at it. I received a genuine NZTA Rego renewal letter yesterday. This morning I received the scam phishing NZTA email. Seems like too much of a coincidence. Are you aware of any compromise that may have contributed to that? I am not aware of any compromise that may have contributed to the likes of information around your registration renewal. These two things coming in at the same time. I know it seems too coincidental, but often these kinds of coincidences do occur. And actually, I do believe that the scammers, the attackers, are trying to hit these coincidental incidences when they can, because it gives a little bit more credence to their narrative. Really great example is the COVID lockdowns. A lot of people, everyone, obviously at home, a lot of people ordering a lot of packages. And what we saw was that the narrative of these phishing messages really took that turn of, you have a parcel that needs to be delivered. We couldn't get it to you. Just click here and give us a little bit of detail, and we'll get it to you in the right cases. So, like I say, I'm not aware of any compromises or breaches that may have contributed to that. Whilst it seems largely impossible to be coincidental, sometimes they do happen. Thoughts on using autofill password options? Just noticed my password manager has this feature. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a different consideration when we're talking about a third-party password manager or those built-in browser password managers. Again, in an organizational space, I would recommend avoiding these kind of autofill features as just an additional layer of security. Yeah, look, it might be a little bit of a pain that you have to enter these manually, or you have to go into the password manager, copy it, paste it. Truth is, sometimes security can be a little bit of a pain. Look, I log into my work desktop and I have to do two-factor authentication every single time. I'll be honest with you, I let out a sigh every time it pops up because it can be a little bit annoying sometimes, especially when you've got something important to get to. But I understand how powerful things like two-factor authentication are, and so I enter it every single time. I go through that process every time because I know what it helps to prevent and how it's keeping me safe, and therefore I understand the value in it. Avoiding things like autofilling your password manager, it may take away some ease of access, but it gives you that little bit of additional security, especially with things like remote access scams as well. I think it's really important to take into consideration what those autofill features could result in if someone did get into our device. Okay, I've gone slightly over. I've gone a minute over. I do apologize for taking too much time. I apologize. I know there's some more questions still in there that I wasn't able to get to. Look, if the team at Westpac want to collect the questions and send them through to me in an email, I'll be more than happy to try and answer those as best I can at a later date.
Amazing. I just want to say a massive thank you, Sam, for your time today and running a really insightful session. And yeah, just to everyone on this call, we will try get the slides off of Sam and post this recording if you want to rewatch or share with any colleagues. And yeah, we will take note of any unanswered questions. But yeah, massive thank you, Sam.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoy your days.